This room held the smell of turpentine and dried earth. Sunlight fell across a chipped wooden table, illuminating the fine grain. A single brush lay abandoned in a jar of cloudy water. Its bristles stiffened into a pale curve. Dust settled gently on a half-empty tube of chrome yellow. The rough plaster wall bore faint smudges of blue and green where fingers had tested the dryness. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grass, a soft whisper against the stone. The silence here was not empty. It held the echo of brushstrokes, the weight of unspoken words. A single fly buzzed slowly near the window, tracing lazy circles in the warm air. My earliest memory is the smell of candle wax melting on the church altar. I was born in Zundert on a March day when the wind carried the scent of thawing earth through the open window. The room felt damp and close, the curtains heavy with winter. My mother's hands were warm and rough against my skin. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour, its sound muffled by the gray sky. It was the same bell that marked my brother's stillbirth 1 year before. I never knew him, only the space where he should have been. My father's footsteps echoed in the hallway, steady and sure. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor, a constant rhythm. The Dutch Reformed Church stood just beyond our garden gate, its steeple piercing the flat horizon. Our house was modest. Whitewashed walls, weathered by the constant wind off the fields. Inside, the air held the faint scent of pipe smoke and old books. My mother's hands moved constantly, mending clothes or preparing meals at the heavy oak table. Sunlight rarely touched the floorboards, filtered as it was through small, leaded panes. I remember tracing the cracks in the plaster with my finger, feeling the rough grain beneath my nail. The fields stretched endlessly beyond the garden fence, golden stubble after harvest, then mud, then green shoots pushing through. I watched the light change hour by hour, the way the low sun cast long shadows across the ditches. Water pooled in the ruts left by cart wheels, reflecting the sky like dull mirrors. The sound of the church clock was the heartbeat of the village. Every hour, its deep tone rolled across the fields, a sound felt in the chest as much as heard. It was made of brass, the mechanism intricate and heavy, needing winding twice daily by the sexton. The sexton climbed the narrow stairs with a heavy key, the smell of oil clinging to his heavy coat. This clock measured the days, the weeks, the slow turning of the seasons. Rain tapped steadily on the roof, a constant companion in those early years. The wind whistled through the cracks around the window frames, a low, mournful sound. I learned the names of the clouds with my siblings: Nimbus, Cirrus, Stratus. We walked the fields with my parents, boots sinking into the soft earth. The paths were lined with tall reeds and dotted with wildflowers, poppies, cornflowers, the small white stars of chamomile. My father pointed out the birds, the lapwing with its long crest, the skylark singing high above the fields. The air smelled of wet grass and turned soil. I recognized the coolness of the stream water on my hands as we dipped them in, watching minnows dart between the reeds, sunlight filtering through the leaves of the willow trees, made patterns on the ground, shifting with the breeze. The quiet of the Dutch evening settled early, a deep hush broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. This quiet was not empty. It was full of the rustle of leaves and the sigh of the wind. It was in this quiet that I first noticed how light touched things, how shadow pooled beneath the hedges. My mother's hands were often stained with ink from the books she helped bind. Her family had worked with paper and glue for generations. I watched her fingers move with quiet precision. The smell of leather and glue sharp in the air. My father's study held the scent of tobacco and old sermons written in careful script. His voice, when he practiced his Sunday words, was calm and measured, filling the small room. The church bell marked the rhythm of our days. I became aware of the vibration of its chime through the soles of my feet on the stone floor. The heavy wooden pews were smooth from generations of use, the grain worn by countless hands. Kneeling on the hard floor during long services, I traced the initials carved by other children long before me. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. Incense smoke curled towards the high ceiling, carrying the scent of myrrh. This was the structure, the steady pulse of our lives. But even then, the quiet held a different quality for me. I became aware of the weight of the silence more deeply, noticed the way dust motes swirled in a single shaft of light. I remember the rough wool of my Sunday coat scratching my neck, the smell of beeswax on the church floor. The taste of communion wine was sharp and unfamiliar on my Tunguian wine was sharp and unfamiliar on my tongue. The hymns rose and fell, a wave of sound that sometimes made my chest achy. My younger brother Theo was born when I was 7. I remember the sound of his first cry, a small, insistent sound in the quiet house. His tiny hands grasped my finger, soft as a bird's wing. I recognized a fierce, quiet protectiveness. We shared a room later. The sound of his breathing a constant beside me in the dark. The fields beyond our window held endless fascination. I collected stones, smooth and cold from the river, their surfaces cool against my palm. I pressed dried flowers between the pages of my father's books, the scent lingering long after. The slow, moving streams reflected the sky perfectly, like liquid glass. I sat for hours, watching the clouds drift, their shapes shifting and dissolving. This deep connection to the earth, to the changing light, was a quiet comfort. It felt like a language only I understood. The rhythm of the seasons dictated our work and rest. Winter brought frost that glittered like crushed diamonds on the bare branches. Spring saw the fields erupt in green, the air thick with the smell of new growth. Summer sun warmed the stone steps outside our door. Autumn brought mist that clung to the fields until midday. The smell of damp leaves sharp and sweet. Each season had its own light, its own texture. I learned to read the weather in the color of the sky, the direction of the wind. The constant wind shaped everything, bending the trees and rippling the fields. It carried the sound of distant church bells from neighboring villages. It was a sound that could soothe or unsettle, depending on the hour. At 11 years old, I left Zundert for the boarding school in Zevenbergen. The journey was long, the carriage wheels grinding on the dirt road. I clutched a small satchel containing a few books and a change of clothes. The smell of the leather seat was strong and unfamiliar. The fields looked different from this height, flatter, more distant. The school building loomed, gray stone and tall windows, imposing and cold. My room was small, the single bed narrow and hard. The sheets smelled faintly of lye soap. The sound of other boys, voices echoed in the stone corridors, loud and unfamiliar. The strict discipline felt like a cage. Rules governed every minute: rising, meals, study, sleep. The headmaster's footsteps were sharp on the wooden floors, a sound that made my shoulders tense. The food was plain and tasteless, eaten in silence. The large classroom held rows of heavy desks, scarred with ink and knife marks. Mine had a deep groove worn by generations of pens, the wood dark and smooth. I traced the groove with my finger, feeling the history of other boys' boredom. The sound of chalk on the blackboard was harsh, grating. Lessons felt endless, the words on the page blurring before my eyes. I missed the open fields, the sound of the wind in the reeds. I missed the quiet companionship of my family, the smell of my mother's cooking. Letters home were my lifeline, written in shaky script by candlelight. I described the grayness, the feeling of being caged. The deep quiet I once knew felt replaced by an emptiness that echoed in my chest. 2 years felt like an eternity. Returning home to Zundert felt like stepping back into a familiar dream. The first canvas in Noonan held the chill of the earth. Thick layers of umber and ochre built up the faces of those peasants hunched over their meal. My fingers relaxed slowly as sleep finally came-membered the coarse weave of the burlap stretcher, the grit of the paint applied straight from the tube. That room smelled of damp wool and boiled potatoes. The steam rising from the pot on the stove mixing with the sharp tang of linseed oil. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the rough, hewn table, illuminating the deep lines carved into those weathered faces. 5 figures, solid as the soil they tilled, their hands gripping coarse earthenware cups. The paint felt thick, almost lumpy, beneath my touch, mimicking the unpeeled skin of the potatoes they shared. A quiet room in Noonan holds the essence of the potato eaters. The rough plaster walls absorb the dim lamplight, casting long shadows across the simple wooden table. The scent of baked earth and stale bread lingers in the cool air. 5 figures huddle close, their faces rendered in thick, dark strokes resembling unpeeled potatoes. The coarse texture of the paint catches the low light, creating a surface that feels tangible, almost gritty beneath the fingers. A single oil lamp glows softly on the table, its warm halo illuminating the worn hands and weathered features. The silence is deep, broken only by the imagined scrape of chairs on the packed earth floor. The heavy atmosphere speaks of exhaustion and shared sustenance, a moment suspended in time before sleep. I learned shadow first, tracing coal dust on paper before daring to touch cadmium yellow. Mastering the dance of light and dark felt like learning to breathe again after the fog of The Hague. My cousin Mauve's studio in The Hague smelled of turpentine and pipe smoke. He showed me how to stretch canvas properly, how to mix grays that weren't muddy. The sea outside his window was a slab of leaden sky meeting slate water, reflected in the wet cobblestones. I filled notebooks with quick charcoal studies, fishermen mending nets, the curve of a woman's back bent over laundry. Over 240 sketches filled my letters to Theo that year. Little more than scratches, really, sent to prove I was working, to show him the lines taking shape beneath my clumsy fingers. The damp Dutch air seeped into my bones. making the thick wool coat a constant companion. My hands were always stained, fingers stiff from the cold. One afternoon, painting a dune landscape, the wind snatched my charcoal stick, sending it skittering across the sand towards the gray sea. The relentless discipline felt necessary, a foundation stone laid in the cold. Black and white were the bones. Color would be the blood, but it needed structure first. The intensity was constant, a fire banked low but burning steadily. Then came the South. Arles in February 1888 hit like a physical blow. The light wasn't gentle. It was a hammer against the eyes, a furnace glow bleaching the pale fields. I arrived shivering, but the sun on the Place Lamartine warmed the stone bench, where I sat, sketching the dusty avenues. The Carroll Hotel room was small, the air tasting of dust and dried herbs. Writing to Theo, my hand trembled not from cold, but from the sheer, shocking brightness. Exhausted, I scrawled, "But the landscape!" The fields weren't green. They were 1,000 yellows, from pale lemon to deep ochre, slashed with violet shadows. I rented the yellow house. 4 rooms painted a sulphur yellow that seemed to vibrate under the Provençal sun. I wired for gas lighting, desperate to paint, even when the fierce daylight faded. My hands, once stained with Dutch grays, now smeared with chrome yellow and cobalt blue. The first week, 4 canvases bloomed like flowers forced in a hothouse. Bouillabaisse gusto indeed. The air hummed with cicadas, thick with the scent of blooming almonds and dust. The orchards in bloom stopped me in my tracks. Pale clouds against the impossible blue. I worked standing before them, the easel planted in the soft earth, the rough canvas vibrating under my knife. Pink. Orchard that April the branches were black lace against the sky. But the blossoms exploded, a froth of pale pink and white. Each stroke deliberate, almost aggressive. The paint wasn't blended, it was applied in thick, visible dabs, building the form like brickwork. The ground beneath the trees was a patchwork of raw sienna and viridian, alive with the hum of unseen insects. The light felt different here, sharper, cleaner, dissolving the heavy atmosphere of Nuenen. It demanded color, pure and unmodulated. Ultramarine hit my eyes like cold water after the Dutch murk. The intensity was relentless. A 15-month furnace where over 140 paintings emerged, each one a step deeper into the light. The fields weren't static. They roared with the wind. The wheat stalks a golden sea, crashing against the dark cypress shores. Then came the sunflowers, August 1888. I bought them by the armful at the market, their heavy heads nodding in the heat. I needed them for Gauguin's arrival. Something vibrant for the Yellow House studio. The first vase sat on the table, stems thick and green, leaves broad and vein. I painted them against a wall the color of dried mustard. The petals weren't uniform. They ranged from deep burnt orange at the center to the brightest cadmium, yellow at the tips, edges sometimes frayed. The paint was applied thickly, almost sculpted. The texture catching the afternoon sun streaming through the shuttered window. The heavy brown centers were pits of shadow, swirling with ochre and raw umber. I made 5 versions, each a slight variation, the angle of the vase, the number of blooms, the intensity of the yellow background. The studio smelled of linseed oil and the faint, dusty scent of the drying petals. The thick impasto made the flowers seem to push forward, demanding attention, a celebration of the sun itself. 5 distinct versions emerged, each exploring a different chord within the same blazing key. Gauguin arrived in October. His presence filled the Yellow House, a different energy, more controlled, more cerebral. We painted side by side in the studio, the air thick with the smell of 2 men's paints. My thick oils, his smoother applications. He painted, the painter of sunflowers, capturing me bent over my canvas, a smaller sunflower painting propped nearby. We argued fiercely about technique late into the gas-lit nights, the sound fading into the night. The nights grew long in that yellow room, the kind where sleep refused to settle like dust on the floorboards. My head buzzed with the day's work, the brush strokes repeating behind my eyelids in crimson and ochre. The bed felt too small, the straw mattress shifting beneath me with every restless turn. Outside, the raw knee whispered against the stones, a sound that usually soothed, but now it scraped like sandpaper on raw skin. I'd lie staring at the ceiling, watching the moonlight carve sharp angles across the pale yellow plaster. The silence pressed down, heavy as wet wool. It was never quiet inside my skull. The walls breathed, expanding and contracting, with a rhythm all their own, swallowing the faint scent of linseed, oil, and stale bread that lingered in the room. My hands trembled against the thin blanket, the muscles tight as piano wire. Sleep was a distant shore I couldn't reach, no matter how hard I paddled through the dark water of exhaustion. The bed felt too small. Sunlight finally seeped through the plain window, weak and watery, catching motes of dust dancing above the simple wooden chair. Its straw seat was worn smooth, polished by years of use. cool against the back of my neck when I finally sat up. The small table held a chipped ceramic pitcher, its surface rough under my fingertips, and a basin with a thin film of water reflecting the pale light. A single portrait hung above the narrow cot, the colors muted, the figure's eyes seeming to follow me across the small space. The soft yellow walls, chosen for calm, felt like they were closing in. The color now harsh, almost acidic in the weak morning. Outside, the Provençal fields stretched silent and vast towards distant hills, indifferent to the storm that had raged within these four walls all night long. The quiet of the room was a lie. The days blurred into a haze of feverish activity and deeper fatigue. I painted furiously, the canvas demanding everything I had left, trying to outrun the exhaustion that clung like damp clothes. Gauguin stayed in the other room, his presence a new tension beneath the surface, a different kind of hum in the air. We spoke of art late into the night, the gas lamps hissing, our voices rising and falling like waves. But the arguments left me hollow, the words echoing long after he'd gone to bed. My hands shook more often, making the fine lines on the canvas waver. Food tasted like ash, the simple bread and coffee barely staying down. The world seemed too loud, the clatter of dishes at the cafe, de la Guerre piercing my skull. I'd sit on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands, watching them tremble, feeling the cold sweat prickle my skin, even in the mild December air. Sleep remained a locked door. The bed felt too small. Then came the 23rd. The air felt thick, charged like before a storm, though the sky was clear and cold. Gauguin left after another sharp exchange, the door clicking shut behind him with finality. The silence in the yellow house pressed in, heavier than before. I paced the small room, the worn floorboards creaking under my boots. The walls seemed to pulse, the yellow turning violent, almost scalding my eyes. The familiar scent of oil paint and dust became cloying, suffocating. My head throbbed, a deep, insistent drumbeat behind my eyes. I found the razor on the small table, the metal cool and sharp against my palm. The blade caught the dim gaslight, a thin line of silver. The sound of my own breathing was loud, ragged. The blood looked black in the moonlight, like ink spilled on the raw knee. The pain registered later, distant, as if it belonged to someone else. I wrapped the piece carefully in a scrap of newspaper, the coarse paper rough against my skin. The streets were quiet, the cobblestones cold beneath my bare feet. I walked to the brothel near Place Lamartine, the familiar door looming. I gave the small parcel to Rachel. The cleaner, her face pale in the dim light. She dropped like a sack of flour, the parcel falling from her hands onto the stone step. I turned and walked back towards the yellow house, the night air sharp in my lungs. Doctor. Ray came later. The smell of antiseptic sharp in the small room at the hospital on Rue de la R.A. Publique. He stitched the wound with careful, practiced hands, the needle pulling through my skin that felt strangely numb. Fever set in, a deep bone, aching heat that made the thin sheets feel like lead. The hospital room was stark. Whitewashed walls, reflecting the weak light from a high window. The smell of carbolic acid stung my nostrils, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. Sleep finally came, but it was a troubled sea, filled with fragmented images, swirling cypresses, Gauguin's stern face, the black water of the Rock-Chou-Ni. Waking brought the dull throb in my head, the stiffness in my limbs. Nurses moved quietly, their footsteps soft on the stone floor, bringing bowls of thin broth that I could barely taste. The silence of the ward was broken only by the distant cough of another patient, the scrape of a chair. Days blurred into a haze of fever and exhaustion. The world reduced to the rough texture of the pillowcase against my cheek, the cool, damp cloth on my forehead. The bed felt too small. Recovery was slow, measured in small things. The ability to sit up without dizziness. The return of appetite for the simple bread they brought. Theo arrived, his face drawn with worry. The smell of train smoke clinging to his coat. He sat by the bed, holding my hand, his grip firm and steady. His presence was a calm harbor after the storm. His voice a steady rhythm against the lingering chaos in my mind. He spoke of the paintings left in the yellow house, safe and waiting. He didn't ask about the night, not then. He simply sat, the rustle of his wool coat a familiar sound, the scent of pipe tobacco faint on his clothes. The small hospital room felt less oppressive with him. There, the whitewashed walls holding less menace. He brought news of Paris, of the art world, grounding me in a reality beyond the fever and the fear. His quiet strength was a lifeline thrown across the chasm. The bed felt less small. Theo handled everything, the practical details of my collapse. He arranged for my paintings to be shipped back to Paris, rolled tightly in sturdy cardboard tubes rather than fragile wooden crates. The canvas, stretched and primed, could withstand the journey rolled, saving precious francs. He wrote letters to our uncle, to Dr. Ray, his script neat and precise on the thin paper. He managed the money, the arrangements, the constant communication with the doctors. His own life, his work at the gallery, his young family, all continued. Yet he made space for my broken pieces. The sheer volume of our correspondence, hundreds of pages filled with his steady hand and mine, became the bedrock. Each letter was a thread, carefully woven, holding us together across the distance. He understood the fragility, the need for quiet understanding. The bed felt less small. Paul arrived in October, when the light softened to honey. He brought his easel and a hunger for new colors. We painted side by side in the yellow house, arguing over brushstrokes as the Rahuro knee flowed past the window. The studio smelled of linseed oil and damp plaster. Gauguin's laugh was loud, his opinions sharper than my palette knives. We shared tobacco and doubts beneath the gas lamps I'd wired. My brother Theo sent francs, trusting this partnership would bloom like the orchards outside. 4 weeks, the colors sang louder than our disagreements. The walls of my room held sketches of Joseph Rulin, the postman, his strong hands resting on his knees. I'd watched him rock Rulin's cradle, the wood smooth from years of use. The Arlésienne Mjinox sat still as stone in the cafe, her shawl the color of dried lavender. My fingers relaxed, slowly as sleep finally came-membered the rough weave of her shawl, the cool porcelain of the cafe table. Gauguin sketched her too, but his lines felt colder, more distant. Our canvases leaned against the yellow walls, breathing the same air. The pressure built like storm clouds over the wheat fields. One evening, the argument turned brittle. Gauguin spoke of discipline, of controlling the chaos. The familiar tremor returned to, in my hands, the world tilting like a poorly hung canvas. The gaslight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for me. He left for the night, stepping into the street's chill. I stayed behind, the silence pressing in like wet clay. The moon hung low over Arles, a pale disk above the river. I found the razor where it always lay, its handle smooth from use. The cold metal touched my ear. The pain was immediate, a hot rush against my cheek. I wrapped the wound with a scrap of cloth, the fabric turning dark and heavy. The blood looked thick as tar in the moonlight, not red at all. I walked to the brothel, the cobblestones cold through my thin shoes. The night air carried the scent of orange blossoms and damp earth. I gave the package to a woman named Rachel, her eyes wide in the doorway light. Then the darkness swallowed me whole. Doctor, Ray came at dawn, his boots scuffing the floorboards. He worked in the small room behind the hospital, the air sharp with carbolic. His hands were steady, his voice calm as he cleaned the wound. I remember the scratch of his pen on paper, the faint smell of ink. He drew the injury carefully, a simple diagram showing where the lube had been taken. Later, Bernadette Murphy would find that very sketch tucked inside Irving Stone's papers, a quiet testament in faded ink. The fever came next, pulling me under like the Raro-Nice current. Ambient passage. The yellow house held its breath. Dust motes danced in the single sunbeam cutting through the shuttered window. An empty chair sat by the table, its straw seat worn smooth from sitting. A half-finished sunflower canvas leaned against the wall, the petals thick with impasto. The scent of dried paint and old bread lingered in the still air. Outside, the Rarni murmured its endless song, indifferent to the silence within. Gauguin left Arles the next day, his footsteps echoing down the empty street. His absence left a hollow space beside me, wider than the missing lobe. Theo arrived soon after, his face drawn with worry. He sat by my bed, the scent of his wool coat mixing with the hospital smells. We spoke little, the words too heavy to lift. The scholars later debated which ear it was. The left, they mostly agree, though Kaufmann, Wildegens, insisted on the right, a confusion born of old, disputed accounts. It mattered little to me then, wrapped in fever dreams. The doctors spoke in low tones about seizures and exhaustion. My head throbbed, each pulse a dull hammer. Doctor. Ray changed the bandages, his fingers gentle. He brought small comforts, a bowl of broth, a clean towel smelling of lye soap. The room was spare, whitewashed walls reflecting the weak sun. A single chair held my clothes, folded neatly. I traced the grain of the wooden floor with my eyes, counting the knots like stars. The absinthe theory gained traction years later, but the 1991 study proved it wrong. The yellow hues in my paintings weren't from drink. They were the sun itself burning into my eyes. Ambient passage, doctor. Ray's surgery tray lay on a side table. The metal instruments gleamed dully, a scalpel, with a bone handle, forceps, a small bowl for blood, a cloth bandage, folded crisp and white, rested beside them. The faint smell of carbolic lingered, sharp and medicinal. Outside the window, a sparrow hopped on the sill, its tiny feet scratching the stone. The afternoon light softened the room's edges, turning dust into gold. Recovery was slow, measured in spoonfuls of broth and moments of clear thought. The fever broke after 10 days, leaving me weak as a newborn lamb. I wrote to Theo from the hospital bed, my hand shaky but determined. The letters were my lifeline, ink flowing like the Arhar Ni. I described the view from the window, a sliver of sky, the curve of a roof, the distant cypress trees standing sentinel. My palate felt distant, a language I might forget. But the colors returned in dreams. Ultramarine, vermilion, the yellow of ripe wheat. The asylum at St. R.A. I called next, a refuge from the world's noise. I entered its gates in May, the lavender fields blooming purple along the road. My room there had barred windows, but the garden was mine. I painted the irises pushing through the gravel, their petals fragile against the stone walls. The cypresses became flames against the Provençal sky, their dark shapes familiar as old friends. Each stroke was a small victory, a way to hold the light steady. Ambient passage. A single sunflower sat in a clay vase on my asylum windowsill. Its heavy head leaned toward the light, the petals fading from bright yellow to soft ochre at the edges. Bees hummed outside the iron bars, a low, comforting drone. The vase was chipped near the base, the glaze worn smooth by handling. Morning light caught the dust on the sill, turning it to fine gold. The scent was faint, earthy like dry grass. Theo visited often, his presence a steady anchor. He brought fresh paints, the tubes smelling of linseed and minerals. We walked the asylum grounds, the gravel crunching underfoot. He never asked about Arles, only spoke of the next exhibition. The letters from Bernard. His quiet faith was a lamp in the long night. The world outside moved on. The Dreyfus affair stirred Paris, but here, time was measured in brushstrokes and healing bones. My paintings gathered dust in Parisian corners, deemed too difficult for easy eyes. An early show noted they were for those who valued searching over certainty. The Roulin portraits traveled with me in spirit. They brought me here, in May with bandaged ears and shaking hands. The carriage wheels rattled on the stone road past St. R.A. Dust hung in the air like powdered ochre. My brother Theo paid the francs. The asylum gate stood heavy and iron. Stone walls rose high against the Provençal sky. The air smelled of thyme and hot limestone. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lavender. The sun lay warm on my neck. The blood had dried dark on my collar. This place felt distant from Arles, distant from the yellow house burning inside me. My room held only a narrow bed. A small table stood by the window. The iron bed frame felt cold beneath thin sheets. Its bars were simple and strong. I traced the metal grooves with my thumb. The mattress smelled faintly of mildew and straw. A single fly buzzed against the glass pane. Outside, the garden stretched quiet and green. Stone pathways wound between raised vegetable plots. Patients moved slowly among the beans and cabbages. Their hands dug soil without hurry. The rhythm of their work felt familiar, like the peasants back in Noonan. I watched clouds drift across the blue dome. Their slow journey calmed my restless mind. The sun painted long shadows across the courtyard. Evening brought the sound of a distant bell. Its tone was deep and steady. It marked the passage of time. I slept little that first week. The moon shone bright through the barred window. Its light felt like a cool hand on my brow. The garden became my daily path. Cypress trees stood sentinel against the sky. Their dark forms twisted upwards like flames frozen. Olive groves stretched towards the horizon. Their silver leaves shimmered under steady golden light. I walked the stone paths each afternoon. The sun warmed the flagstones beneath my boots. My footsteps echoed softly on the ancient rock. I carried a small stool and canvas. Sketchbook pages filled with quick lines. I drew the irises pushing through damp earth. Their purple heads nodded in the breeze. The air carried dry herbs and warm earth. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight. Distant birdsong mixed with cicada hum. I mixed zinc white with cobalt blue in my tin. The paint felt thick and cool on my brush. Each stroke captured the garden's quiet pulse. My hands steadied as I worked. The trembling faded with each passing hour. I painted 2 canvases before noon. The yellow flowers held the light like captured suns. Their petals glowed with inner fire. Patients sat on simple benches nearby. One old man watched clouds for hours. His face was calm as weathered stone. The old man never spoke, but shared his silence. This garden offered space for reflection. It held me when my thoughts grew sharp. The quality of afternoon light transformed weeds into beauty. Ordinary plants became profound subjects. I learned to see the slow turning of the world. 140. 2 paintings filled my year here. The number surprised even me. Each canvas held a piece of this piece. A single olive branch tapped softly against the iron grating. Its leaves made a quiet scratching sound. Dust. Motes danced in the slanted sunlight falling across the wooden floor. The silence was deep and uninterrupted. Outside, the distant bell called for evening prayer. I watched the sky change through the small window. The fading light turned the cypresses into dark sentinels. Their shapes moved against the horizon. This view became my foundation for night visions. I painted it from memory when darkness fell. The textured paint of Starry Night captured that quiet intensity. Swirling blues and golds held the garden's soul. My brush moved in urgent circles that night. The sky felt alive above the sleeping asylum. Stars pulsed like distant lanterns. The cypress tree reached up as a black flame. Sleeplessness fueled those creative bursts. Yet the work brought calm contemplation later. I worked late by candlelight after the bell. The wax dripped onto the wooden table. Its scent mixed with linseed oil. My letters to Theo described the olive groves. I wrote of the gnarled trunks and silver leaves. He sent tubes of chrome yellow and emerald green. Each color felt like a promise. The garden's rhythm anchored difficult days. Patients gathered for meals in the refectory. Wooden bowls held soup and coarse bread. The steam rose in thin blue lines. I sketched the steam rising from the bowls. Simple things held deep meaning here. The world felt smaller but more complete. The olive groves stretched beyond the asylum walls. There silver leaves caught the morning light. I walked among the ancient trees each dawn. The ground was dry and cracked underfoot. Small stones crunched beneath my worn boots. The air smelled of sun, warmed bark and dust. My fingers brushed rough bark on twisted trunks. Some trees bent sideways from the mistral wind. Their roots clung deep to the rocky soil. I sat beneath a gnarled olive with my sketchbook. The sun filtered through the leaves above. Dappled light moved across the paper. I drew the play of light and shadow. The quiet hum of insects filled the air. A lizard darted across the path. Its scales flashed green in the sun. I mixed raw sienna with burnt umber. The paint captured the earth's warm tone. Over 100 drawings came from these walks. Each line held the grove's quiet strength. Patients rarely followed me into the groves. The path was too narrow for the attendants. Solitude felt safe among these ancient trees. The groves taught me patience. Their slow growth mirrored my own healing. I painted the olive pickers in September. Their hands moved through the branches with care. Baskets filled with fruit under the autumn sun. The paintings held the harvest's golden warmth. My brushstrokes followed the wind's direction. The groves became part of my visual language. Their rhythm stayed with me long after. Sleep came easier on nights after the groves. The scent of dry leaves lingered in my room. The infirmary room held a stillness all its own. A wooden chair stood by the narrow bed. Its legs were worn smooth by time. The mattress cover smelled faintly of vinegar. Sunlight fell across the floorboards in long strips. Dust floated in the quiet air. A small bowl held clean water on the table. My hands rested on the rough blanket. The walls were whitewashed and bare. A single fly walked the window ledge. Its legs made tiny clicking sounds. Outside, the garden slept under moonlight. The cypress trees stood black against the stars. I felt the cool sheets against my skin. My breathing slowed to match the night's rhythm. Sleeplessness often visited this room, but the quiet held no terror here. I watched the moonlight move across the floor. It traced slow paths on the wooden boards. The silence felt like a deep pool. My thoughts drifted like leaves on water. The attendants checked on me with soft steps. Their lantern light glowed under the door. I heard the rustle of sheets in the dark. "Overs, sir." Eyes greeted me with damp meadows and the soft gray light of early May. The train station platform smelled of wet wool and coal smoke as I stepped down, my valise heavy with clean brushes and tubes of paint. "Doctor." Gatchett's house stood just beyond the village square, its garden thick with hollyhocks, and the sour tang of crushed mint underfoot. He met me at the door, hands cool and precise as he checked my pulse, his spectacles catching the weak sunlight. The room he gave me overlooked a field of young wheat, its blades trembling in the breeze like green flames. Rain tapped on the studio roof that first afternoon, a steady rhythm as I unpacked my paints. Ultramarine, vermilion, the thick smell of linseed oil filling the small space. I slept deeply that night, the first real sleep in months. The mattress straw rustling softly beneath me. The doctor's study held a brass microscope and rows of labeled jars containing camphor and foxglove tinctures. His hands moved with quiet certainty when adjusting my dosage, the glass bottles clicking softly on the wooden tray. Each morning I walked the same path past the thatched cottages, their walls stained with decades of rain. The air carried the scent of baking bread and the damp earth of freshly turned fields. I carried my easel and stool, the wooden legs scraping against the cobbled streets. My canvas bag held worn brushes, a chipped tin of water, and a small mirror wrapped in brown paper. The fields stretched before me, endless waves of green and gold rippling under the pale sky. Crows circled low over the distant hills, their cries sharp against the silence. I worked until my fingers cramped, the paint drying in stiff ridges on my palette knife. The village church stood solid against the horizon, its spire piercing the soft clouds. I painted it from the hillside where the wild poppies grew thick among the grasses. The stone walls absorbed the light, turning deep rose in the late afternoon sun. My brush dragged thick strokes of cobalt across the wet white ground, the church emerging like a shadow against the luminous sky. Rain often came suddenly, cold drops spotting the canvas, forcing me to pack quickly beneath the overhanging branches of an old oak. The wet earth smelled rich and dark, worms surfacing near my boots. I returned to the same spot day after day, the path worn smooth under my feet. My shoes grew stiff with dried mud, the laces frayed from constant use. Doctor. Gashett joined me sometimes, sitting quietly on a folding stool, his presence calm as he observed my work. He spoke little of medicine, more of art and the quiet strength found in routine. His garden shed held shelves of dried herbs, their dusty scent mixing with the smell of turpentine. I painted his hands holding a foxglove flower, the veins prominent against the pale skin. The thick impasto captured the rough texture of his knuckles, the brush strokes building the form like clay. We shared simple meals of bread and cheese on the porch, the shadows lengthening across the courtyard. His daughter, Marguerite, brought tea in thin porcelain cups, the steam rising in the cool air. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel path became a familiar comfort. One morning, the wheat field near the ravine held a strange stillness. The stalks stood tall and heavy, their golden heads bowed under the weight of ripening grain. A single crow landed on a fence post, its feathers glossy black against the pale sky. I mixed ochre with raw sienna, the colors swirling together on the palette like molten honey. The canvas grew dense with texture, each stroke a deliberate mark against the blue, gray background. My knife scraped thick ridges of paint across the surface, creating the illusion of wind, swept grain. The earth beneath me felt cool and solid. The smell of dry grass and warm soil rising with the heat of the day. Distant church bells marked the hour, their sound carried on the breeze. My brushes wore down to stumps after 3 weeks of constant work. The doctor noted the speed with which I consumed materials, ordering fresh canvases and tubes of paint without comment. I painted the river eyes at dawn, the water reflecting the soft pinks and lavenders of the waking sky. Mist rose from the banks, clinging to the reeds where dragonflies darted. My fingers ached from gripping the brush too tightly, the joints stiff with cold as the sun rose. A small wooden bench sat near the water's edge, its surface worn smooth by generations of fishermen. The quiet rhythm of the current soothed my restless thoughts. The gentle lap of water against the stones. I returned each morning before the village stirred, the path lit only by the fading stars. The church interior held cool shadows and the faint smell of old wood and candle wax. I sat on the worn stone step, sketching the arches and the simple wooden pews. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the beams. The stone floor was uneven under my boots, smoothed by centuries of footsteps. A single sparrow fluttered near the rafters, its wings making a soft whisper against the vaulted ceiling. The cool air held the scent of beeswax polish and damp stone. I painted the empty space where the altar stood, the light falling across the empty space like a blessing. My fingers traced the rough texture of the stone wall, cool and solid against my skin. The silence here felt deep and undisturbed, a quiet refuge. Ambient passage. The doctor's study window overlooked the herb garden. Sunlight caught the glass of a mercury thermometer hanging from a nail. Dried lavender stalks lay bundled on a wooden table beside a mortar and pestle. A single drop of water fell from the eaves outside, striking the stone sill with a soft. After the letters stopped coming, Johanna sorted them by candlelight in her Amsterdam flat. The paper felt rough under her ink, stained fingers, smelling faintly of pipe smoke and old wool. She copied each one carefully onto fresh sheets, her lamp casting long shadows across the floorboards. The ink blurred sometimes where tears had fallen. She sent paintings to small galleries nobody knew, wrapped in burlap sacks tied with twine. 5 francs for a frame, if she was lucky. She never spoke much about the weight of it all, just kept working. The silence in that room was thick, like dust settling after a storm. Theo's name appeared in fewer letters as the years passed. Johanna kept his portrait above her writing desk, the paint thick as dried honey. She remembered the sound of his voice through the crackling telephone wire, asking after the wheat fields. She sold a painting for 50 guilders once, enough for bread and beans that week. The buyer thought the colors too harsh, like staring into a furnace. She wrapped the next one in newspaper, tied it with string. The train whistle blew outside her window each morning. Life moved on. The colors stayed. In Berlin, a young painter named Kirchner scraped his canvas with a palette knife, mimicking the thick strokes he'd seen in a dog-eared catalogue. the smell of linseed oil mixed with cheap beer in his cramped studio. He painted street scenes where faces melted into the background, all jagged lines and bruised purples. In Paris, Matisse pinned a small print of my sunflowers above his sink, the paper curling at the edges from steam. He mixed cadmium yellow straight from the tube, no white, just pure fire. The galleries called it madness. The young ones called it truth. The paint on their canvases felt heavy, like wet clay. Ambient passage, a wooden bench in a Munich gallery, smooth from decades of use. The grain shows where countless palms have rested, worn down by time and quiet contemplation. Dust motes drift in the slanted afternoon light from a high window, catching the golden hollow around the frame of Starry Night over the Rau Ernie. The floorboards creak softly underfoot, a rhythm older than the building itself. Someone's dropped a single dried leaf near the radiator vent. It trembles slightly in the warm draft. Johanna never saw the crowds that came later. She died in 1925, her hands still stained with ink. The museum doors opened wider. People stood for hours before a single canvas, their breath fogging the glass on cold winter mornings. They traced the brushstrokes with their eyes, seeing the ridges in the paint where the knife had dug deep. The yellow of the bedroom walls felt warm, almost touchable. Children pointed at the swirling stars, whispering. The guards shuffled their feet, accustomed to the hush. 1 million visitors saw my work in the first decade after her death. The number felt impossible then. The fields I painted near Overs still grow wheat each summer. Farmers drive modern machines through the same furrows. The diesel smell sharp in the air. Tourists leave pebbles on my grave, small tokens against the rough stone. The cemetery path is worn smooth by so many footsteps. Rain washes the pebbles clean. In Tokyo, a woman sits before irises at the National Western Art Museum, her reflection ghostly in the glass. She brings a small notebook, fills a page with careful pencil lines. The museum air hums with the quiet of hundreds of people breathing together. Her scarf smells of lavender soap. Ambient passage. A brass plaque, screwed into the wall of a New York gallery, cool to the touch. Engraved letters show faint scratches from countless fingertips, tracing the name. The metal has a dull sheen, polished by time and accidental contact. A single hair lies across the lower corner, caught in the dust. The floor beneath it is scuffed, darker where generations of shoes have paused. The hum of the climate control unit vibrates the metal ever so slightly. Of Theo's letters yellowed in archives, the paper brittle as autumn leaves. Scholars now handle them with cotton gloves, turning pages under soft lamps. They see the coffee stains where he paused to drink, the smudges from a hurried hand. The words describe the cost of canvas in 1880. 3 francs per meter. They mention the rain in Montmartre, how the studio roof leaked onto the easel. The mundane details hold the weight. The letters fill 800 pages in the printed edition. The smell of the old paper is sweet, like forgotten apples. Museum guards know the regulars. An old man comes every Tuesday to stand before the Olive Grove painting, hands clasped behind his back. He wears the same gray coat, smelling faintly of mothballs. He never stays long, maybe 10 minutes. He nods once, as if greeting an old friend. The guard sees him wipe his eye with a knuckle before turning away. The paint in that grove is layered, so thick it casts its own shadow on the wall. The guard's shoes squeak on the polished floor as he walks his round. The silence feels respectful. Ambient passage. A single sunflower seed, dark and hard, pressed into the sticky residue near the base of a museum bench. It lies half, hidden under the wooden slat, unnoticed by passers-by. A shaft of light catches its oily surface for a moment. The scent of beeswax polish lingers in the air, mingling with the faint, dry smell of old paper from nearby catalogues. A slow drip echoes from a distant restroom. Johanna would not recognize the crowds now. 1 million people saw my work last year alone. They flow through the rooms like a slow river, pausing at the bedroom, at Eve Cave Terrace at night. They come from places I never heard of, speaking languages I couldn't understand. They stand close, seeing the canvas weave beneath the paint, the places where the primer shows through. The museum air is cool, smelling of filtered dust and wool coats. A child drops a candy wrapper. It's swept away before it settles. The paintings hang steady, silent witnesses. The yellow house in Arles is rebuilt, though not quite the same shade. Tourists take photographs, the flash popping like tiny lightning bugs. They stand where I placed the chairs where Gauguin slept. The street is quieter now, no trams clattering by.